We're going to look at the paleontology of the flood. Paleontology is a science. However, with a science, we should start with Scripture. Yet when we look at Scripture, we find very little explicitly in the Bible about fossils and their formation. We find a little bit about the flood in the Bible, a few chapters devoted to it. But there's little in that description that directly applies to fossils. We have reference to the breakup of the fountains of the great deep at the beginning of the flood. We have the fountains of the great deep. We have the windows of heaven that are referred to. We have the fact that the flood is a global flood over the entire earth. It's covering the mountains for at least part of that time, and it lasts for more than a year. It killed all the land animals and humans, but again, no explicit mention of paleontology. So we're going to have to learn about our flood paleontology from the fossils themselves, all the while keeping in mind as we're studying them that we can't forget the Bible. We've got to keep going back and checking to make sure that what we're postulating about fossils is in fact consistent with the biblical account. Our first question we might have is it possible that perhaps the fossils were created by God in the beginning? The problem is that some of the fossils are in fact animal fossils, and thus they are direct evidence of animal death. In our understanding of Scripture, we have the introduction of nephesh death, or death of nephesh life, animals, only coming with the flood, with the fall. And it's then unlikely that God would have created in the original creation evidence of death in the original creation that wasn't going to be introduced into the world until after the fall. So I think we're forced to conclude, at least that when we're looking at the fossils of animals, that we have to be looking at a time after the creation. So which fossils of those that were formed after the creation, the animal fossils, were formed in the flood, or are any of them formed in the flood? Let's look at the major features of Earth's fossils to answer that particular question. We look at the biostratigraphic column. That is a representation of the rocks of the Earth as they're stacked up across the Earth. It is a biostratigraphic column. It is a column of rock layers or strata. That's the stratigraphic portion of it. And in the rocks, there are organisms. That's the bios that we're referring to. So this is a stack of rocks and their associated fossils as they are found across the planet. In the lower part of the biostratigraphic column, even in some places tens of thousands of feet, we have rocks, but we do not have animal fossils. In fact, we don't have plant fossils. We don't have any fossils of any macroorganisms at all. The only fossils we find in this lowest portion of the fossil record are bacteria. This is most of the Precambrian, with the exception of the very uppermost Precambrian, which has got a few more organisms in it. There are no animals for most of the Precambrian. Above that point, once we start getting especially animal fossils, we have a biostratigraphic column that has been built from primarily marine organisms. Most of the fossils on the planet are in fact of shallow marine organisms, as a matter of fact. Relatively few are in fact land animals or plants, that sort of thing. So this is primarily based upon the most abundant fossils, which would be marine organisms. From that biostratigraphic column, we've been able to divide the organisms up into different faunas. For example, there are three major marine megafaunas. There is one in the lower part of the biostratigraphic column called the Cambrian megafauna. And then there's one above it called the Paleozoic megafauna. And then there is finally one marine megafauna that goes from the top of the Paleozoic all the way to the present, which has been entitled the modern marine megafauna. If you look at the terrestrial world, the terrestrial fossils, the fossils of land animals and plants and aquatic animals, things that live on the land, we find basically three megafaunas and floras in the terrestrial world. There is a primary, a Paleozoic fauna, if you wish. It doesn't go as far down as the Paleozoic fauna of the marine world, but nonetheless ends at about the same point in the stratigraphic column. There is a secondary land fauna flora that corresponds to, that is in between the Paleozoic and the modern, and then there is a modern fauna. If we look at that modern fauna, the rocks that represent that modern fauna, we also have in that particular zone increasingly modern fossils. As a matter of fact, again, referring to marine organisms, they subdivided this upper portion of the column according to how many of the fossils we find in that rock are in fact modern. It's percent modern species. At the very base, we have rocks with no modern species at all. As we go up the Cenozoic, we have increasing percentage of modern species. Also, when we expand this and look more closely at it, we find that species are found from a certain depth up to a certain point. It's called the stratigraphic range of a given organism. We have overlapping stratigraphic ranges. We have organisms that seem to begin at one point, end at another, and another organism is overlapping with it. There's no clear place where we can make a boundary between some event before, some event after. So this seems to be a continuous sequence. That, combined with the percent living species, suggests that we have no breaks in here from any, no significant breaks in sedimentation and fossilization. And then when you look within families in this same zone, we find that there are many families that show a sequence of fossils all the way up, and in fact a series of very logical family lineages, one species not only overlapping with the next, but in fact logically transitioning from that species. There's no direct transitions, but it looks like you could line those up. It looks like those species really could have transitioned one to another. An example here from the frog family, but there's many other examples that we have in this column. What this suggests is that this upper portion of the column, which is often called the Cenozoic, is in fact after the flood. It is the modern world. It's in between the Cenozoic and the Precambrian then that we most logically will put the fossils of the flood. In that zone then, between the upper Precambrian and the base of the Cenozoic, we have billions and billions of fossils. There's billions of organisms that were in fact buried in the flood. As a matter of fact, if you look at the fossil record of the flood, you find all sorts of organisms in the fossil record that you do not find in the living world. There's a long list of these. There's 57 classes that we have in the fossil record, but we don't have in the present world. We have 231 orders in the fossil record that we don't have in the present world. And there's even larger number of families and genera and species. So we're looking at not only lots of fossils, but fossils of a world that was far more diverse than the present world. So the flood seems to have decimated life. By decimated, I mean it had a certain diversity before the flood, and it significantly narrowed that diversity in the course of the flood. This suggests that the flood was, in fact, a catastrophe. It was a very unusual event that very rapidly destroyed a significant number of organisms, both on the land and on the sea. Another characteristic of the fossils in this zone of what we're ascribing to the flood is that they're common and well preserved. There are many fossils. And this is kind of an unusual characteristic because in the present world, it's not an easy thing to, in fact, it's not often that you can find fossils. It's not easy to produce fossils. If we played a little game and asked ourselves, if you wanted to be a fossil, if you were a little critter that wanted to be a fossil, what would it take to get yourself fossilized? It would be quite a process, actually. You might be, if you're, again, the most common kind of fossil is a marine invertebrate fossil, so you're swimming around in the shallow marine zone, maybe you're a cephalopod or something like that. What do you have to do, or what has to happen for you to get preserved as a fossil? First thing is you've got to avoid the carnivores, those that are out to eat you, because most of the time the carnivores, when they consume you, will in fact crunch you up and you won't be able to be preserved as a fossil because there won't be much left of you. And then, so maybe during your life you can keep away from the carnivores, but once you die, of course, you can no longer have any choice in the matter, but you have to avoid another problem at that point. You have to avoid the scavengers. In the modern world, scavengers are very effective at destroying the bodies of dead organisms, both on the land and in the sea, maybe even more especially in the sea. The fact is that God created organisms in such a way that there's a whole group of organisms. Their job is to eat up, consume the organisms that die or parts of organisms that die so that we don't end up in a pile of dead bodies. So scavengers, the decomposers of the environment, are usually very effective at destroying bodies. For an organism to end up being fossilized, you've got to get away from the scavengers. And probably one of the best ways to do that is to get buried or covered so that the scavengers can't see you. But there's another problem you have to encounter, which is the problem of the aerobic decomposers. There are those that are running around on the surface looking for dead bodies that are sitting on the surface, and especially in the marine realm, there are organisms then that dig into the mud at the bottom of the ocean, at the bottom of even especially the shallow marine portion of the ocean, and they're continually churning it up, finding dead organisms at depth. They will in fact decompose them. I have referred to them as the aerobic decomposers because they dig into the mud and circulate ocean water down into their burrows. They're bringing oxygen into those places. These organisms require oxygen in order to do their decomposition. Because of that, because they have access to oxygen, their decomposition is actually usually very efficient and very effective. And so this is a zone that's it's very difficult to survive through. Again, if you want to be a fossil, you're going to be destroyed almost certainly if you end up in this zone. So how do you get out of this zone? How do you get into a position where you can be fossilized? Best way would be to be buried far enough or deep enough that you're not only out of sight of the scavengers, but you're below the depth of oxygen for the aerobic decomposers. Problem is, aerobic decomposers usually can burrow down scores of feet. In a very quick time can get several feet down. So you've got to be buried pretty fast in order to get out of this aerobic decomposition zone. And very few organisms, certainly in the present world, end up being able to get through that zone, buried deep enough, soon enough, that they can be preserved as fossils. But even when you get to that point, you've got another problem. You've got a problem with the anaerobic decomposers. There are bacteria that don't require oxygen that continue the process of decomposition. Sure, they act more slowly, but over time they are quite effective too at destroying what remains. And then, let's say you do get buried deep enough, fast enough that you can get out of the scavengers and the aerobic decomposers and maybe even keep ahead of the anaerobic decomposers. Once you've been made into a fossil, you've still got to avoid the process of erosion that brings your fossil back up, brings you as a fossil back up to the surface. After all, you want to get discovered and end up in a museum drawer. But in order to get discovered, you were deeply buried, so you're going to have to be brought up to the surface somehow so that you can be discovered. In other words, erosion of the stuff that's above you has to occur, but that puts you at risk of being destroyed by that same erosion. It's a very tricky process. It's a very unusual, unlikely thing that you would end up getting exposed at the surface, not trampled by a cow or something like that before you can be discovered and put into a museum drawer. The point is that in the present world, fossilization is a rare process. It's very hard to reproduce the conditions that make fossilization optimal. As a consequence, you wouldn't expect the commonness of fossils that we see in the fossil record, and certainly the fact that they're extremely well preserved. What this suggests is that there's a rapid burial that's occurring during the flood that is not occurring in the present world, or not commonly occurring in the present world, which combined with this evidence of catastrophe suggests we have a catastrophe of very rapid burial during the flood. Another observation that we deduce from the fossils is that the fossils have been transported a very long ways, and that they've been transported along lines of latitude. This is, it's not always possible to deduce this, but in some cases it's pretty clear that this is what's happening. You have a fossil, let's say, you have a coral fossil that is preserved in what was originally a carbonate mud. Well, that's a problem because corals have to grow on solid surfaces. They're sitting in mud, they sink into the mud, and it kills them. So the fact that this coral is now deposited or found in what was originally mud must mean that it was carried from some other place to that location. That's not where it lived. So what you do is you follow the rock along to find out where you got evidence of a hard surface. And you often have to trace these rocks for hundreds of miles, sometimes thousands of miles, before you ever encounter any reasonable place that such a fossil could come from. These kinds of inferences suggest over and over again that organisms in this flood fossil zone have been carried huge distances to be buried where they are. They've been buried rapidly, but they've also been carried a long ways before they were buried. And when you start putting all the pieces together, and do this for a number of different organisms, you notice that when they're buried in the same kind of latitude you might expect them to have lived in. For example, with coral. Coral in the present world is restricted to within about 30 degrees north and south of the equator because they require rather warm temperature in the water. They would like a situation where calcium carbonate is in the water and ready to precipitate out, easy for the organisms to take out calcium carbonate and deposit shell material, coral material with it from that material. And so when we see these corals that we have to trace a long distance, we still find them in this burial site that's a long ways from wherever they came from, typically within a short distance of the equator. So what we seem to see is that consistently, if you can figure this out for a given fossil, if it's evident with a given fossil what climate it's normally living in, it's very frequently, most of the time, found in the same latitude as it should have been growing in. This suggests that there is a current that is carrying the fossils, the organisms that are going to become fossils, long distances, and it's following latitude lines. When you add that together with evidence from sedimentology of the direction of currents, you find that these fossils have actually been transported long distances along latitude lines from the east to the west, consistently across this flood fossil zone. Another observation is that footprints are found in among these fossils, and there's two characteristics that are common with these characteristics. First, that they're found in or were formed in water, not exposed in the atmosphere. And secondly, that the footprints are found below the body fossils. So, for example, here we've got some footprints in a sandstone in the Grand Canyon. There's a little bit of an outline of the little guy. It's basically a labyrinthodont footprint, a type of amphibian. You've got several of them here, 1, 2, 3, 4. There's the trackway of the little fella. And the direction of trackway is indicated by those prints that I pointed out, but the individual prints are actually faced at a slightly different angle than the trackway is. So he seems to be walking kind of cockeyed to the direction of the trail, which suggests that there is a current of water. Water is moving along and pushing him. This is probably not in wind situations. It's got to be in water, especially since this particular animal is a very low-lying animal. So the evidence is that there must be a water current that is causing him to put his feet, orient his feet upstream so that he doesn't slide away, so that he isn't washed away, and then make his way across the current at an angle. From this, we can determine the direction of current, the type of current that animals experienced. If we look at dinosaur prints, for example, we find that the quality of the dinosaur prints suggests that they were formed underwater. There are some. It's also been observed for a very long time that dinosaur prints seem to lack tail drags. You've got the prints of the dinosaurs, but you rarely get a drag of a tail. I have seen a couple tail drags. The one I've seen actually in person in the field is one where it's clear that the animal threw his tail down as he was falling, because then it's followed by a body print. Usually, however, the tail is not on the ground. It's not preserved. So it either suggests that dinosaurs always kept their tails above the ground, which seems a little odd, or the footprints are being deposited in water and the tails are being suspended by the water. I think the evidence is for the latter, which suggests that most dinosaur prints are actually made underwater. Furthermore, a second observation with footprints is when you find a given organism in the fossil record, typically you'll find his footprints before you find his body fossils, before you find his bones, or before you find his shells. For example, when you first find trilobites in the fossil record at the base of the Cambrian, the very oldest rocks that contain animal fossils, you don't find the shells of the trilobites, you find the footprints, what's called Cruziana. In the lower left there, we have a picture of Cruziana footprints. They're the little trackways that little guys make. You have to go up the stratigraphic column some distance, in some cases several dozens of feet, to finally get the first shells. And these shells are made of calcium carbonate. I mean, these shells are pretty solid. They're made of limestone. It should be easy to preserve them if they were there, yet what we have are footprints that occur for a number of layers before we finally get the bodies. Same thing happens with the dinosaurs. The very oldest evidence we have of dinosaurs are footprints. It isn't until later that we get the bones. It would seem, in the face of it, that it would be easier to preserve bones than it would be to preserve footprints, but the fossil record shows footprints before bones. I would suggest that what this is referring to is that organisms are escaping from a catastrophe. They're running for their life while sedimentation is occurring very rapidly. So you see their escape trackways before you finally get their bodies at a higher level. So the footprints that are formed underwater and formed before the body fossils suggest that we have both terrestrial and marine organisms overwhelmed by this catastrophe, which is consistent with the global flood we have mentioned in Scripture. Another issue is the issue of disparity before diversity and stasis before abrupt appearance. The difference between disparity and diversity. Diversity is the number of organisms that you have. It's how many different species you have. Disparity is how different those species are. In an evolutionary perspective of things, organisms in fact change through time according to an evolutionary tree. New species come in slightly different than species that were already there, gradually branching out, gradually becoming more and more different from the original species. So in order to create great disparity or difference among and between organisms, you have to actually branch a number of times before you can get there. On the way, you're increasing the number of species. So it should be that you cannot produce, in evolutionary theory, great disparity before you've already produced great diversity. So as Stephen Jay Gould and others have said, with evolution you would expect diversity to appear before disparity in the fossil record, but alas, what fossils show over and over again is high disparity at the beginning, long before we get any diversity. For example, the oldest arthropods, some of the oldest arthropods in the world are found in the Burgess Shale. Beautiful preservation, so well preserved that you can actually dissect the individuals as fossils with their internal parts. It's extraordinary stuff. In the Burgess Shale, if you set aside the trilobites, there are 21 species of arthropods that have been described, and they represent 20 different classes of the phylum Arthropoda. So the major groups of arthropods, that's the highest classification of arthropods, at basically the first level that you find arthropods at all, you find 20 different classes. There are only 5 classes of arthropods in the present. And there's only 21 species representing 20 different classes. That's huge disparity. That's more disparity than you in fact have in the present arthropods, and they're represented by only one more species than there is disparity. That is not what you'd expect in evolutionary theory. The same thing is seen with the echinoderms. You have a very large number of echinoderm classes that appear when you first see the echinoderms. You have fewer echinoderms in the present, and you have a very low diversity of echinoderms when they first appear. The fossil record shows the opposite of what evolution predicts. It shows disparity before diversity. But I would suggest that the observation of disparity before diversity fits a flood account, because if the flood is coming in and, let's say, picking up entire ecosystems and carrying them and burying them, when it picks up an ecosystem, the ecosystem has a very high disparity. It has trees, let's say it's a terrestrial ecosystem. It has trees, and it has insects, and it has, let's say, mammals, and it's got fish in the little streams, and it's got bacteria, and it's got a very high disparity. Compared to the diversity of the world, it's got a very low diversity. So it's got very high disparity, the full disparity of life, and yet a relatively low diversity. So if the flood picked up a community and dumped it in place, the first community it laid in would in fact have very high disparity with relatively low diversity. It's exactly what the fossil record shows. On the issue of organismal change, evolution in fact predicts gradual change of one organism to another. So if your A is going to evolve into B and C, you would expect a series of transitions between A and B and A and C. And it would expect that the divergence could be seen between B and C as things go up in the fossil record. What fossils actually show, though, is not this gradual change and divergence. Fossils show stasis and abrupt appearance, as Stephen Jay Gould used to describe it. Stasis means that when you find a particular species in the record at one level, the oldest one you've got, it stays the same. You find the same species throughout its entire range, and then it disappears. You don't find the species changing at all. It is in stasis. And when you first find the species, there's no transition evident in the fossils from any other species. So it's sudden appearance and then stasis through time. And it's not just true of species, as Stephen Jay Gould argued, it's actually also true of every taxonomic level. Now, I would say this is certainly not something predicted by evolutionary theory, but it is expected with a flood. Because if, in fact, you have a world already full of organisms, and you take that world and dump it into the fossil record, every time the fossil record in that sense has sampled from the world, let's say it's sampling dogs, it comes and samples a dog and buries him here, and then buries him here and here and here. Since it's all from the same species, because they all lived at the same time, they should not change up through the record. You would expect stasis with a flood model. Also, what's the likelihood that the first time you picked up that dog, there would be any other fossils that had just been laid down that look like you're transitioning into a dog? That would be extremely improbable, if not impossible altogether. So the disparity before diversity, the stasis and abrupt appearance, which is very common among organisms, suggests that we have what is called a global life assemblage. It's a living group of organisms, living communities, living ecosystems and biomes across the world that are picked up suddenly in a flood and dumped and buried. So you've got the high disparity with low diversity from such a living assemblage. You've got the stasis and abrupt appearance from the same thing. So we have evidence of, so far, catastrophe, rapid burial, strong east-west current, global flood, and global life assemblage. Then we have evidence that the fossils make a gradual transition from low in the sequence to high in the sequence, from sea to land. The only way this can really be shown is if you create a tree of relationship of organisms. This is something I did a number of years ago to test whether the evolutionary claim was true, that the evolutionary tree of organisms is shown or proven by the fossil record. I had heard a number of my professors through time say the fossils show the order of evolution. What they meant was that in the evolutionary tree, the appearance, the order of branching that evolution says occurred is reflected in the order that those groups of organisms first appeared in the fossil record. So I set about to test that. In order to test it, you've got to first of all create the evolutionary tree. So I used the best information that was available at the time to create an evolutionary tree of all organisms. In this case, I'm going to be looking just at the orders and above, and this is part of that evolutionary tree, but this part down here called eukaryotic kingdoms, there's more to the tree that I can't fit on here. So we look at that tree, and there's two more branches on that tree that I can't fit on here, so you need to stick the plants in there, and you need to stick the animals in there. So you got a very big tree. Now, once you've done that, you can then look at this tree and predict from it what the order of branching should be. It should be that the tree started down here and made its way out to the final result. So I would expect that the first branches would be the Placozoa and the Porifera in this particular tree. Then we should get the Archaeocyathids. Then we should get the Cnidarians. Then you should get the Ctenophores, and so on. This tree allows us to predict an order of branching. When you do that and lay them all out, you find that actually the order of branching predicted by evolution from this tree doesn't really correspond with the order of branching that you find in the fossil record, or I should say with the order of first appearance in the fossil record. In other words, when evolution says this group should have come first, that's not usually the first group in the fossil record. And so 95% of the time, you can't reject a random order of first appearance in the fossil record. It's not consistent with evolutionary theory. So really, there's nothing to explain in the fossil record. It looks like randomness, except for the fact that the 5% that does seem to correspond happens to be in groups where evolution says this group evolved from sea to land. So for example, it says that the plants evolved from the sea to land, and the plant groups seem to come into the fossil record in the same order that evolution says they should. The land animals are thought to have evolved from the sea, and they come in the order that evolution predicts they should come in. So it appears that there's evidence, for the most part, of randomness, but the only pattern that really has to be explained is a sea to land transition, which is what I'd expect with a flood. A flood, in fact, buries things in the ocean first, and then eventually transgresses onto the land, taking things off of the land. This can be tested. As a matter of fact, I became interested in one of those groups that seems to correspond between evolution and the order in the fossil record, and that's the classes of plants. And here's the list of those. Most of them you're probably not at all familiar with, because most of them are in fact extinct. The last one down there, Magnolia phyta, refers to the flowering plants, which are most of the plants of the world, the 250,000 flowering plants of the world. You got cycads and the conifers in there, but most of these others are in fact extinct groups. This is the order of branching predicted by evolution. And you can put numbers on these things. This is the actual order of first appearance, or actually when these groups come in the fossil record. Again, looking at rocks from the bottom to the top, the bottom rocks being the oldest, the upper rocks being the youngest. We start out with and the width of this thing on the screen would in fact be how many species, how many groups, how many how many species there are of a particular group. So at the very first, the fossil plants are represented by only a single species. With time, the number of plants increases. And then how many of those plants are in each of the groups is indicated here. And from this, we can see in the fossil record what order these groups first appeared in. You can compare the order predicted by evolution with the order predicted shown by the fossil record, and you find a tremendous correspondence. It's 99% of the pattern can be explained by evolution, or putting it another way, the plants do seem to come into the fossil record in the same order as evolution. However, in addition to looking at it from an evolutionary perspective, you could also ask a different question. What order would you predict them to come in if you arrange them from sea to land? What if you considered the plants that have to have standing water to reproduce at one end of the spectrum, and then put them side by side as per how much water they need to survive, all the way up to animals that can survive even in, let's say, desert environments? When you put them in an order of what might be called terrestriality, from non-terrestrial to terrestrial, you get a pattern like you have at the right. Now the pattern at the right looks very similar to the pattern at the left, extremely similar. It's not quite the same, but from this you can then predict a pattern of branching that evolution would predict, and a pattern of branching that ecology would predict if these things were arranged from sea to land. And you can compare those and do more statistics. You basically get the same pattern. In other words, evolution can predict the pattern, but also another thing that could have produced the pattern is if the plants were actually lined up from sea to land with increasing terrestriality. Is there anything that makes sense of that? Well, I conceived of a theory a number of years ago to in fact explain that because of my experience once on a floating bog, on a quaking bog, one of these vegetation mats that grows out over a lake from the shore, which is a wild experience. I realized that in that situation, the plants in the floating bog were arranged from the open water to the land in increasing terrestriality. That made sense. The plants that were growing out over the water, they needed water. They lived in water continuously. The plants that were on the shore didn't need that much water. So they were arranged in a water to land, increasing terrestriality order. And so I thought, well, maybe these plants in the fossil record were arranged in the same way. What if they actually represent a floating forest, like a quaking bog? So I reconstructed a forest by basically taking the order in the fossil record and then bringing it straight up to draw a picture of this floating forest. I proposed that there was a floating forest on the pre-flood world's oceans that's the size of a continent, very large. In the size of North America, for example. It's huge. And I say that it's large like that because the main trees of this, in fact, produce the coals of the eastern United States, Europe, and Asia. That's a lot of coal. That's a lot of forest. So we have to propose a very large forest to explain it. In this particular theory, this floating forest would have existed in the world before the flood, would have floated on the oceans before the flood, would have been quite fine until it came to the flood. When the flood came along, waves would tend to break up this forest, and they'd break it up from the outside of the forest towards the middle. And so the first things that would be torn off and buried would be the organisms at the edge of the forest, and then it would work its way in towards the center of the forest. This would actually explain the order of appearance of the major groups of plants, which is what I was interested in the first place. It also means that if you looked at the organisms, the plants that were buried at the bottom, it's like you were looking at the edge of this floating forest. So if you go into a museum and you see a diorama for the early Devonian, that'd be pretty old rocks with plants in them. This is going to illustrate several plants like zostrophytes and rhiniophytes and so on. But this is basically a picture not of a particular time in Earth history before the rest of the plants. Rather, it's the edge of the floating forest looking out to sea. Ignore the mountains in the background, and you've got a picture of the edge of the floating forest. And the pictures, the beautiful dioramas that are found around the world in various museums for what the coal forest looked like would be pictures of what the center of this floating forest looked like. So when you go into a museum and see a sequence of dioramas that are supposed to be looking at the world at different times in its history, sort of turn it over in your brain and walk through the floating forest from the outside edge to the middle. So a floating forest theory explains the increasing terrestriality of plants in the fossil record, but it explains another thing too. I realized that in the floating bogs that I had been on, the plants that grow out over the water were very small plants. Whereas as you get further and further away from the water towards the shore, the plants get progressively taller. So there's actually an increase in size corresponding to the increase in terrestriality in modern quaking bogs. There's also an increase in size corresponding to the increase in terrestriality in the fossil record. So the floating forest theory explains both of those. Plus, it explains the fact that most of these fossil plants are extinct or near extinct. And it makes sense because if in fact there was a floating forest before the flood, and the flood destroyed that floating forest, it's unlikely that the floating forest would ever be able to regrow on the rough oceans following the flood. God could have created the floating forest in place and it would be quite happy until the flood, but once you have destroyed it and you now have winds and choppy seas following the flood, I don't see any way in which that floating forest could regrow. That would mean that the plants of the floating forest would be hard-pressed to find an ecosystem where they could live, because their ecosystem, the one they were designed for, has been destroyed. So it would explain why most of these plants are in fact extinct or near extinct. The other observation that is consistent with this theory, and something I was always bothered by when I saw the fossil plants myself through the years, is that many of these plants are actually preserved in marine sediments. They're not found in terrestrial sediments, the sediments on the land. They were found in marine sediments, sometimes intermixed with other fossils that would indicate a marine situation. So I used to ask my professors, well, how is it that this particular fossil ends up in a marine environment? He says, well, it floats down the river and ends up being deposited out there in the ocean, being carried there by the rivers. The problem there is that in the marine realm, those organisms at the bottom of the ocean do a very good job of destroying whatever comes down the streams. We just don't find fossils like that in those kinds of environments. This theory, however, says that the reason we find these plants in marine rocks is because it was a marine ecosystem. It floated above the marine realm, and when it was destroyed and buried in the marine realm, so it explains why, in fact, they're found in marine rocks. Another thing it explains, though, is the fact that some of these plants are actually very strange. If you look at a cross-section of the trees found in the center of this floating forest, in other words, the trees of the coal forest, you find that they're basically hollow. Now, technically, they're not hollow as in air in them. They have parenchymatous tissue in the center of it, which means they have a very light, thin tissue that has as its purpose carrying air. But there are cells and cell tissues in there to facilitate that. Most of the structure, most of the weight of the tree is held up by bark, successive layers of bark, and not what we're used to in the center of trees, which is called secondary wood. There's no secondary wood in these things. They're basically hollow or airy tissues in the center of the stems. And even the roots, or what look like roots, they're technically not roots because of this feature, the roots are also hollow, which is an odd thought. How in the world does a plant put a hollow root into soil? How does it force its way into soil and remain hollow? And it gets worse when you see that coming off of the roots or rhizomes are perpendicular to them are straw-sized, soft, hollow structures that are coming off of the roots, the rootlets. They come off at 90 degrees to the main axis. They are hollow and they're clearly very soft. How in the world does that grow through soil? No idea. In fact, in the present world, we do have some these are tree-sized, but in the present world, we have plants that are hollow-stemmed, hollow-rooted, and have just exactly that kind of rootlet, where the rootlets come out from the main root at 90 degrees to the primary root, and they're hollow. And all of those plants are themselves floating plants. They have this hollow or parenchymatous tissue to float on top of water. And back in 1981, Joachim Scheven in Germany proposed that these plants, just the center plants of what I'm calling the floating forest, in fact floated. He proposed this. I didn't know about this when I proposed my theory of the floating forest. He had a number of years proposed this for just some of the trees, namely the large trees of the coal forest. Another thing, this particular theory, the floating forest theory, explains the strange anatomy of the plants pointed out by Joachim Scheven. Another thing this theory explains is coal, at least the kind of coal we have in the eastern United States, Europe, and Western Russia. According to the typical explanation, coal is made in what's called a coal swamp. There are supposedly trees living in this swamp. They're dropping their material, their leaves and branches down into the swamp. It is, because of the nature of the swamp, it isn't decomposing terribly well and accumulating as a layer of peat at the bottom of the swamp, peat that will then later be formed into coal. Now I'm representing a coal seam by these rectangles of blue. Imagine the blue rectangles continuing to the right and to the left indefinitely. These are layers of coal. Typically, a coal layer has a very flat top, so I am representing it by a exactly rectangular thing, and that's because coal seams typically do have a very flat top. They also typically have a flat base, quite strikingly flat base, and sometimes the coal is divided into separate layers by what have come to be called benches by the coal miners. These benches will contain, for example, a layer of marine clay with sometimes fossils in it that are often extensive. You can find these things across counties and so on. Inside the coal itself, Steve Austin was a creationist who received his doctorate on coal in 1979, studied the Kentucky 12 coal in Kentucky, and discovered when he looked carefully at the coal itself that he could identify chunks of bark in the coal and could follow them for a long enough distance to realize that the chunks of bark were dinner plate sized, typically, in the coal, and that most of the coal was made of, in fact, bark. Okay, so those are the characteristics of coal. He also observed in the Kentucky 12 these general observations: flat top, flat bottom, flat benches. He actually had 2 or 3 benches in the Kentucky 12 coal with only a few centimeters of clay in the benches. There's a problem with this description of coal, and as it corresponds to the swamp theory for its origin. Here's a picture of a drain swamp in Nova Scotia with Steve Austin, the one who had studied the coal, there checking it out. It's the dark stuff above that is the actual peat from a drain swamp. The stuff down below, the lighter stuff down below, are rocks that swamp was sitting on. Notice there are some white things sticking out of the peat. These white things are actually roots of plants that were living in the swamp. So you might expect that in swamps like have been described as forming coal, that you should have a lot of roots. If you look at the actual material there between the roots, Steve describes it as kind of like coffee grounds. You can't find large pieces of anything. You can't find a branch, you can't find leaves, you can't find bark fragments. Usually the largest fragments you see are coffee ground size, sometimes even just fine coffee ground size. This makes sense. It's the roots running through all of this stuff breaks the stuff up. There is some decomposition that occurs because of bacteria in here. And so basically, usually what you would expect in a swamp situation is that you're not going to be able to preserve large pieces, recognizable pieces of the original trees, which makes the observation of bark chunks in the coal, pieces of bark in the coal, recognizable pieces of bark in the coal, not explained by a swamp theory. In addition, we have a problem creating let's say, a flat base. In this particular situation, we have a relatively flat base because it's sitting directly on solid rock. But if it isn't sitting on rock, the roots of the plant should reach down underneath the coal, underneath the organic matter, and root themselves in the clay underneath. Underneath these coals almost always is a clay, or what used to be a clay before the coal was formed. And yet we do not find roots reaching down from the coal into the clay underneath. Furthermore, if it did that, it would make the surface uneven. Where the trees stick up out of it, it would be uneven compared to the areas between trees. But coal has a very flat base, very typically. What about the flat top? I asked about this when I was in school. I asked my professors, how in the world do we get the flat top on the coal? They said, well, I lived in Illinois and went to school in Illinois, so I didn't know much about hurricanes, so this answer satisfied me for the moment until I actually saw this. They said, well, a hurricane comes through and destroys the swamp and levels the swamp, and that produces the flat top of the coal. Oh, okay. Until I saw the result of a hurricane in South Carolina, and I actually saw an instance where a coastal swamp was hit by a hurricane, picked up out of it, was destroyed. I mean, just devastated, completely destroyed. And a lot of the debris of the swamp was dumped on a city that was just slightly inland of that. Visiting that locality, there is no way you describe this swamp as shaved flat. There were trees broken off at various heights. There were trees turned down with the roots sticking up in the air. Branches and trunks are laying in every which direction. It was impossible to walk through this stuff. It was by no means flat, by no means shaved off. I don't see any way you could get the swamp shaved off to create at the end a flat top for your coal. But let's say we gave it to you that somehow there's a way to shave off this thing and you end up with a flat layer of coal. Now, let's talk about how you produce these benches. You got a flat layer of coal, so now you've got an inch of clay comes in and covers the coal. Okay, good. Now, we got coal on top of it, so we're going to have to bring a swamp back in again. We're going to have to bring in trees back in to produce the next layer of coal. How do the trees root in 1 inch of clay without disrupting the clay? How do you get the plants that are going to drop the stuff for the next layer of coal to grow in a layer of clay without disturbing the layer of clay at all? The layer of clay has a flat bottom and a flat top. It's undisturbed. There's no way you can explain the features of coal by this swamp theory. That was the conclusion Steve Austin came to with the Kentucky 12 coal. And so Steve, in trying to understand that particular coal, proposed a floating log mat idea. An idea that the logs of the trees of the coal forest, and remember those trees are hollow basically, mostly bark, not much of anything else, that these trees, these logs with bark on them, were floating in large numbers on a body of water. They floated against one another, rubbed against one another, and peeled off their bark. The bark floated down to the bottom got waterlogged and floated down to the bottom, and accumulated as a layer of bark on the bottom of this body of water. That would explain why you got a bunch of pieces of bark to make up the coal. Also, if you started out this whole story with a flat layer of mud at the bottom of this body of water, and then this log mat blew in by the wind over that mud, dropped a bunch of bark on top of it, it would explain why the base of that pile of bark was flat, because the original layer of mud was flat. You produced your layer of bark, then let's say the wind blew that log mat away. It's leaving a pretty flat layer of bark there. An inch or so, whatever you want, of clay can come in over the top of it, mud can come in over the top, and then the log mat can blow back over the top once again and produce another layer of bark on top of the seat, on top of that layer of shale. So, and that would have a flat bottom, and when it blew away again, a flat top. So with his floating log mat model, Steve Austin in 1979 defended a PhD dissertation to explain the origin of the Kentucky 12 coal, explaining the flat base, flat top, the thin benches, the bark chunks that are found in the coal. He can explain the Kentucky 12 coal and received a PhD for that description. Interestingly enough, within 1 year, Mount St. Helens blew its top and, among other things, had an avalanche that flowed into the Spirit Lake, pushing the water of Spirit Lake out of the lake, up the side of the mountains around the lake, that with a tidal wave that was more than 300 feet high. That tidal wave picked up trees and all the plant material and soil and all that off of those mountains, and then finally settled back into where the lake originally was. But by now, the avalanche material had raised the bottom and thus raised the lake a number of feet. And when it all settled out, at the end of this, floating on top of the new Spirit Lake was 1 million logs that had been scraped off the side of the mountains around it. These logs then rolled against one another, rolled their bark off. The bark settled down to the bottom of the lake and became a great test plot for Steve Austin's theory. And so he went diving in the lake to see if in fact there was bark at the bottom of the lake, and alas, he found in places up to 3 feet of bark underneath this floating log mat on Spirit Lake. So he seemed to have a great explanation for the origin of coal, at least the Kentucky 12, and you can extend it beyond that because the coal seams that I have seen have these features. I haven't looked at it microscopically for the pieces of bark, but the other features are quite evident in every coal seam I've seen. In addition, when you follow these benches out, invariably the benches become or go right into marine sediments, which fits this hypothesis as well. It's also consistent with the fact that we have taken carbon-14 ages on coals, and we don't get millions of years for the age of the coals. We get thousands of years, certainly closer to the biblical account. Also, if you look at the total amount of coal we have in the world of this nature, it's consistent. We can explain it with a continent-sized floating forest. Also, the geographic distribution of that coal. At the time the coal was deposited, there's reason to believe that the continents were together. Europe was adjacent to North America, and the distribution of coal is across eastern U.S., Europe, and western Russia. It is that region that could easily have been under a huge log mat that had been destroyed from the floating forest, floating over that region of the world. Also, the fact that when we find this coal, we don't find one layer of coal, we find multiple layers of coal. The Kentucky 12 seam is the 12th seam in a series of seams that are counted from one direction or the other up. In the Illinois Basin, for example, we have 120 coal seams. And there's this repeated sequence of shale and limestone and coal and shale and limestone, coal and sand that goes all the way through the sequence. The coals come in and they go out. The coals come back again. It's consistent with the idea of a floating mat floating back and forth over this region, dropping coal as it did. So a given region is going to see coal, and then there's going to be other things deposited, then another seam of coal, and then other things deposited, another seam of coal. It explains the repeated sequence of sediments that we find associated with the coal. Also, when we study the coal, the rocks associated with the coal, the shales underneath and the shales above, you find there are fossils in here that don't change from the base of the coal seams, so these 120 coal seams, and from the base of this all the way up to the top, both here in the United States and in Europe, we find the same fossils, same species, from the base of the coal seams all the way up to the top of the coal seams. And according to conventional dating, that's 100 million years of time. We have 100 million years in the rock record where the species don't change one bit. Now, it makes sense if, in fact, this is not 100 million years, but in fact, one flood and one destroyed ecosystem dropping its fossils over this area. It's the same fossils from the bottom to the top. That would be easily explained. So a floating forest ecosystem explains the evolutionary order, apparent evolutionary order of plant divisions. It explains why they're mostly extinct. It explains also, I didn't mention this, but if you have this floating forest with animals that are created for that floating forest, the animals created on the edge of this forest where the mat was very, very thin have got to be specially designed organisms. I would suggest create fish that had legs that can move around they could use their legs to move around on the mat, but they didn't put their weight on the mat because otherwise it's so thin that they'd go through. So I believe God created special fishopods or something of that nature to live on the edge of these floating forests. When the floating forests were destroyed in the flood, those animals were deposited associated with the plants at the edge of the forest. You would first get the fish deposited away from the floating forest, then the fishopods, then you would get the critters in the center of the forest, like the amphibians, and then you'd finally get the land animals later. This sequence would explain the sequence of vertebrates from sea to land. It explains the marine sediments that are associated with this, the biomass of the coal. It incorporates Joachim Cheven's anatomy of the coal trees, and it incorporates Steve Austin's log mat model for the origin of coal. If you accept that interpretation, then if we look back at the biostratigraphic column, the floating forest biome is located here it's in the lower half of the column of flood fossils, and that suggests that everything in the lower part here is actually marine. All the evidence that people have pointed to for terrestrial sedimentation would actually be in a floating forest over the marine realm. So technically, it's a marine ecosystem. That would make all of this marine, and it would make everything above that terrestrial. So the flood starts out by taking out things in the marine realm. First, what's called the Cambrian fauna that live primarily on the bottom of the shallow marine zone, and then take out the Paleozoic marine fauna with the floating forest, and then moves onto the land, picking up the dinosaur biomes, the gymnosperms associated with them. So we have a marine to land transition in the course of the flood. I believe that the fossils of the flood are in fact best explained by the flood. The processes responsible for the major features of the Earth's fossil record are a global sedimentation, deposition in water, deposition by catastrophe, and in fact, destruction of everything on the planet, which is consistent with God's judgment of man's sin in the flood in the days of Noah.